Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
If you are interested in serving on your local Federal Subsistence Regional Advisory Council, the deadline to apply is Friday, March 21st. The councils provide information and recommendations to the Federal Subsistence Board on subsistence hunting, trapping, and fishing. For more information on the advisory councils and how to apply, call 1-800-478-1456 or email subsistence@fws.gov. This message sponsored by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 13th of March. As always, we encourage you to visit our website for the very latest watches, warnings, and advisories around Alaska. You can do that by going to arh.noaa.gov or weather.gov/Alaska. That'll take you to the statewide view. If you go to weather.gov/Anchorage or /Juneau or /Fairbanks, you'll get your more local view that way as well. The weather info line is open at 800-472-0391. On Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, you can find weather information all day long on the devices that you use around your house, or perhaps if you're sitting at the library at the local computer, that's another way to keep up to date with information and share that with your friends and relatives around your community, village, or city. Here's a look at the situation as we see it as of tonight. Blizzard warnings now in effect for Kodiak, and later on toward the morning hours, we'll see them go into effect for the Homer Bluffs and the Kachemak Bay area. Blizzards mean poor visibility, blowing wind, and snow. And in this case, we expect some of the heaviest snow around Kodiak Island to be around Fognak, with several inches around the Kodiak region as well. And you'll see that blizzard warning continue as we go into about 10 o'clock Friday. That should wind down. For the Kenai Peninsula, that will start around 7 o'clock in the morning and continue until midnight as we head into Friday night, early Saturday morning. So conditions will worsen during the day from south to north as rain transitions to snow and the wind picks up. So look for a rapid change in weather conditions there along the Cook Inlet as low pressure is working just to the east of Kodiak now and moving up the Cook Inlet throughout the day. That's also sending a lot of air across the Alaska Range, and as we go through the daytime tomorrow north of Talkeetna and into the Denali area, the eastern Alaska Range and the Deltana and Tanana Flats region, expect some pretty strong gusts, especially through the passes, but also along some of the higher terrain there. You can expect gusts over 70 miles per hour. So there's going to be a lot of moving wind across some of the higher terrain into the interior. That's doing wonders for your weather and keeping things pretty dry, sending temperatures soaring in places like Eagle today. Saw some very mild weather in the mid-40s, but it is going to be a rather blustery day. So if you're traveling through any of the passes with high-profile vehicles or just trying to fly through the passes, be prepared for some rough and tumble weather there, just thanks to the excessive amount of air moving through those gaps. Now out across the west, winter weather continues. It is certainly still winter in Alaska, and for the lower Yukon and the Yukon Delta region, as well as eastern Norton Sound, all of the Seward Peninsula, the Chukchi Seacoast, and the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island, you are under some type of winter weather advisory or winter storm warning. The darker areas are winter storm warnings, and in these areas we expect higher snowfall accumulations. The Chukchi Seacoast, you have a winter storm warning until 6 o'clock on Friday. 7 inches of snow is falling, about half of that again already on the ground. 6 inches of snow around parts of the Chukchi Seacoast down toward the northern and interior parts of the Seward Peninsula there. Again, your winter storm warning goes until about 6 o'clock on Friday. About half of that storm accumulation is already fallen. We're looking for about 7 inches of snow on the southern parts of the Seward Peninsula. That will include Nome. Half of that's already fallen again. Your warning also continues until 6 o'clock on Friday. For eastern parts of Norton Sound, as much as 6 to 10 inches of snow, maybe even more, maybe as high as 12 inches of snow in some cases. A winter storm warning for you continues until noon on Friday, so your conditions will improve a little bit faster. And then once again along the Yukon Delta region, a winter weather advisory. For that area, we're expecting anywhere from 3 to 6 inches of snow. and a little bit higher amounts as you head upriver there. Around McGrath, winter weather advisories, same goes for areas around Galena. And St. Lawrence Island, you're included in that as well. There are no watches, warnings, or advisories for the Arctic coast, or really for the center or northern parts of the interior, with the exceptions of the Alaska Range and the flats. And out across south and west, things are calming down. They're not quiet just yet, but they're getting there. As we look around the Bering Sea, you'll notice we're still looking at that northerly flow wrapping around low pressure as it extends into the interior and up the west coast. We're already seeing new batches of moisture develop out across eastern parts of Asia and the North Pacific. A lot of low clouds across the interior, across the Bering Sea. A lot of what we're seeing under this is just scattered snow showers. That trend's going to continue probably through the weekend as several waves rotate around that overall low pressure circulation. Just expect bands of snow to develop and then fade away as they cross over the Aleutians. Looking at the statewide view here, you can see our circulation working up from the Gulf of Alaska, dragging in colder and drier air behind it. The trend of this is to move up the Cook Inlet and into the interior. It has several kind of lobes of low pressure around it, so it's not just one single storm, but there are several other circulations attached to this overall system. With that, it's bringing that southeasterly flow into the Panhandle, more rain, and eventually some snow for some parts of the northern sections of southeast, and likely looking at some heavier snowfall amounts across some parts of the higher terrain in the Chugach and the Kenai Pen, but really going to focus on Kodiak Island and again the Homer Bluffs and the Kachemak Bay area as far as the worst weather goes. Look for the potential for snow and rain across south central and the Mat-Su as we go into Friday too. Probably just a real quick hit before it winds down. Here's a look at the weather map, and if it looks a little complicated, it probably is. A southeasterly flow again bringing scattered rain across parts of southeast, and pretty broad flow keeping that warm and wet air trapped right up against the east and northern parts of the Gulf. Here's our 975 millibar low, another part of the circulation just east of Norton Sound, a little bit south and west of Galena. Colder air is working its way into the Gulf and the North Pacific there. Scattered snow across the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula, around Dutch Harbor and Unalaska, the YK Delta, around the west and southern parts of the Seward Peninsula, around the Chukchi Seacoast. As warmer air is working its way northward, we're getting a little bit of a break in that precipitation thanks to that downward moving air, which is drying north of the Alaska Range and into the Yukon Valley. As we get into the forecast tonight, you'll notice that occlusion shaping up across the Arctic coast and the west coast. This is not really a very pretty storm at all. We've got warm air just kind of spreading out everywhere across Alaska, creating pretty good focusing mechanism for snowfall across the west coast. A lot of upper level storm energy wrapping into this here and really powering up this storm around Kodiak and south central. And as that energizes the circulation, the winds are going to pick up and the cold air is going to drop down into places like Kodiak, Kachemak Bay, and the Homer Bluffs. And it's a pretty good setup, it looks like, for not only poor visibility, but a decent amount of snow to fall in a kind of a short amount of time. Rain's going to continue across southeast. We're still looking at a good pressure gradient here across southeast. That should keep the winds going. The wind direction should change as we get into Friday and Saturday there, so watch for some changes. And the dry weather should continue across the interior and points north and east. You're noticing a partly to mostly cloudy sky, probably not a lot of precipitation. Anything you see should be pretty brief and kind of hit and miss. And across the Aleutians, snow showers continue up and down the chain and also out to sea. The good news is, for those of you watching the ice edge closing in on St. Paul, that will likely lift and change directions a little bit out to the west and north as we get into the weekend there. So some changing wind currents for you should bring an improvement to the direction of the travel of the ice. For Friday's forecast, a 986 millibar low up around the Seward Peninsula and northward into Kotzebue Sound. You'll notice that system across south central also lifting a little bit further north throughout the day. That will drag in some drier weather as we get into Friday. Don't be surprised to see the sun by the end of the day. Snow showers may continue around Kodiak with more of a westerly flow. Cold front crossing through the Gulf of Alaska. Trough of low pressure sitting just west of southeast will keep the opportunity for onshore flow and rain across the southeastern part of the state. Still looking dry across Fairbanks up toward Fort Yukon, Arctic Village, the Arctic coast, looking at a mostly sunny to partly sunny type day. It may be a little bit windier though across the Bering Strait as a pressure gradient tightens up on the west side of this low pressure system. That should allow some colder air to drop southward and keep snow showers going across the YK Delta and into southwestern Alaska. Looking out west, you see a new wave of low pressure working toward the western part of the chain at 969 millibars. That deepens heading into Saturday. The occlusion works into the southern part of the Bering Sea, the Pribilof, St. Matthew, and points out toward eastern Russia, still looking at scattered snow showers. A rain-snow mix quickly soars across the central and western parts of the chain. Rain on the south side of this possible for the central chain. And across Bristol Bay, scattered snow showers continue. We'll see a scattering of passing snow showers across south central as high pressure works to establish itself across the mid-Yukon Valley and west of Fairbanks and around Tanana. That's going to break up a lot of the clouds. It's not going to be very conducive for a whole lot of snow to fall in any one spot, but it isn't going to be entirely dry as well. This is kind of a messy or dirty high pressure system, but it does look like a good setup for snow across the west and northwest coast. Snow will continue to fall as we head into the weekend there. The 996 millibar low now weakening, but still sitting off the Chukchi Seacoast. That will keep the moisture, the warmth, and the lift focused on northwestern parts of Alaska. What about southeast? Well, 993 millibar low off the coast of southeast, just southwest of Haida Gwaii, working another frontal boundary north, so look for the winds to come up. There will be changing in from the south, and that focusing line for precipitation will work its way quickly northward toward Juneau and northern sections of southeast as we head into Saturday afternoon and Sunday night. So an awful lot going on. Pick a spot in Alaska and there's probably some type of precipitation falling by the end of the weekend. The winds are changing, temperatures are changing, and again, what you see today is not what you'll have by the end of the weekend for sure. Temperature-wise, across southeast today, temps were in the lower to mid-40s. Juneau 43, Ketchikan and Annette, Sitka, everybody was fairly mild today. 40 around Haines and Skagway, 37 in Yakutat, 30s and 40s for Prince William Sound today. Homer and Seward also very close to 40 degrees, if not even warmer. 36 in Kenai, 34 in Anchorage, 44 in Glen Allen today. We saw Eagle and Northway both fairly mild, but Eagle again saw temperatures in the mid-40s for a time. Lower 40s around Fairbanks, 42 in Denali and windy today. Tanana, upper 20s. Fort Yukon was 27 degrees. Anaktuvuk Pass saw temps just nudging 20 degrees by late afternoon. Temps still south of the 0 degree mark around the Arctic coast, anywhere from 5 to 10 below. Barrow was about 3 below. The Chukchi Seacoast saw milder weather setting in around Kotzebue. It was 27 degrees. 13 in Nome. Shishmaref was just 1, with eastern parts of Norton Sound looking at 10 degrees around Unalakleet, 19 around Grayling, 40 in McGrath, 1 above in Bethel, 2 below in Nunivak, and St. Lawrence Island looking at temperatures between 5 and 10 below today. Kodiak saw temperatures in the lower 40s. The Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay in the teens and 20s, with King Salmon and Dillingham both at 25. The Pribilof saw temperatures in the teens today, 26 in Dutch Harbor, Unalaska, and not too far above that for Adak and Atka. Overnight low temperatures will be close to the freezing point around parts of south central and Prince William Sound. Kodiak should cool off overnight. Look for southeast to remain above freezing. Some areas around Skagway and Haines may be a little bit colder. Yakutat 34. The interior looking at temps a little bit colder around Fairbanks. The surrounding areas probably in the teens and 20s. Fort Yukon looking at 0, 4 below in Arctic Village, and from 5 to 15 below across the Arctic coast. Kotzebue Sound temperatures anywhere from 5 to 10 above, maybe a little bit milder where you are. Bethel 1 below. The Alaska Peninsula again in the teens and 20s, with highs tomorrow in the upper 20s approaching 30 for some. St. Paul looking at 16, Bethel 5 above, Nome 14, Kotzebue Sound in the teens and 20s. The Arctic coast about 5 to 10 above, the warmest around Kaktovik. Ambler and Bettles both approaching the freezing point there. Probably not making it, but it's going to be close. 34 in Breezy and Fairbanks. Eagle and Northway also in the upper 30s. 33 in Talkeetna. Low to mid 30s for South Central. Kodiak only 25, and Southeast looking at highs approaching 40 degrees, maybe passing it for a few. Flying weather shows a wide swath of IFR across South Central and the northern Gulf Coast, also across the windward side of the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern chain out toward the Pribilofs and around the Chukchi Seacoast area in the western and interior parts of the Seward Peninsula, and of course the leading edge of the new storm working its way out of the North Pacific. MVFR for a wide swath of southeast. Anaktuvuk Pass and Adigan Pass are both expected to be VFR tomorrow. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, with the storm moving up the Cook Inlet, expect IFR conditions, especially on the east side. Rainy Pass should be IFR thanks to snow and poor visibility, and Windy Pass expected to turn over to at least MVFR throughout the day. Windy conditions across Isabel Pass, MVFR conditions expected there. Mentasta Pass, VFR through the pass itself, though turbulence may be an issue, and look for approaching MVFR conditions as the day develops from the south side. As you look a little bit farther south toward Tanita Pass, VFR turning toward MVFR throughout the day. Also breezy conditions expected there. Porter's Pass we expect to be IFR with turbulence in the area, and Chilcoot and White Pass should lean over toward IFR as your Friday goes on. Freezing levels, we'll notice that colder air dropping south of the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians. That really hasn't changed much since yesterday. The surface, the aloft levels there, anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 feet across southeast, all wrapping into the storm that's working its way northward up the Cook Inlet tomorrow. Icing potential, anywhere below 10,000 feet, you may run into at least light to isolated moderate icing across the Chukchi Seacoast and the western tip of the Seward Peninsula. Also ahead of the storm, below 10,000 feet to as high as 12,000 feet from northern parts of southeast into the Susitna Valley and also across the Copper River Basin. Looking at the jet stream, you'll notice a large area of low pressure dropping even further south now into the North Pacific and the Gulf. We've got a very well-established southwesterly flow coming into southeast, a broader southerly flow cutting right into Alaska and the ridge here across extreme eastern parts of Alaska and the northern parts of the Northwest Territories. Another wave of low pressure coming off of Asia will keep our active pattern going across Alaska for the coming days. A southerly flow at 9,000 feet, keeping winds moving from 20 to 40 knots. A north and westerly flow coming in on the south side of this, as high as 35 to 50 knots there, and a broader southerly flow coming to southeast, keeping the wet weather going. So quiet weather continues for the interior with this type of pattern. Low pressure across Norton Sound out towards St. Lawrence Island, giving us more of a westerly flow coming right into Bristol Bay and cutting right across Kodiak Island at about 20 knots, 15 to 25 knots. From south to north across the eastern parts of the interior and the upper Yukon. Winds are relatively light just west of the Alaska Range at 3,000 feet, but really pick up speed as you cross over the western parts of the Brooks Range at around 30 knots. Turbulence potential, there is a lot of opportunity for that tomorrow with low pressure working over pretty varied terrain. Expect strong gap flows not only across the Alaska Range but also across the Kenai and Talkeetna Mountains and the Alaska Peninsula. Anywhere from 6,000 to 12,000 feet, you'll likely run into at least light to isolated moderate, maybe even occasional moderate across south central, the Alaska Range, and around the Seward Peninsula into the middle Yukon Valley and the Nulato Hills. For southeast, expect at least some light chop below 6,000 feet and across the western Aleutian chain. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with your marine weather here in just a few minutes.
The celestial superhighway. Welcome to Stargazers. I'm Dean Regas, astronomer from the Cincinnati Observatory.
And I'm Marlene Hidalgo, science teacher from Miami, Florida.
And I'm James Elberry, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida. Next week, the moon will have a close encounter with three bright objects in our night sky: the red planet Mars, the blue giant star Spica, and the ringed planet Saturn.
Have you ever wondered why the moon always seems to follow a path that brings it close to the planets? Why does the moon never go through the stars of the Big Dipper, for example?
Yes, and why do you never see planets among the stars of Cassiopeia or Perseus? They all seem to follow the same pathway through the sky, as if they're traveling on a celestial superhighway. Well, we have the answer for you. Let's show you. By studying the movements of the planets, moon and sun against the background stars, modern astronomers were able to figure out how our solar system formed. This hypothesis was later supported by observations made using the Hubble Space Telescope.
Deep inside the Great Orion Nebula, astronomers found what are believed to be other solar systems forming around brand new stars. As gravity makes these clouds of gas and dust collapse on themselves, they begin to spin. As they get smaller, they spin faster, and eventually they flatten into a disk.
Over time, material begins to clump together throughout the spinning disk of gas and dust. This process is called accretion. When enough material accretes in one place, you get asteroids, comets, moons, and planets. As far as our solar system goes, the momentum from the original solar nebula is what we see today as the motion of the planets through the sky. Here's how we figured it out. Let's look at the sun's apparent motion first. During the course of a year, the sun appears to gradually drift eastward against the background stars. This yearly apparent motion of the sun is caused by our Earth's motion around the sun.
Now, let's imagine viewing this from space, high above the solar system. If you draw a straight line of sight from the Earth to the sun, from the Earth's perspective, the sun will appear to be in front of the stars in the background. As we orbit the sun in a counterclockwise direction, from Earth it appears that the sun is moving from right to left against the background stars.
This path that the sun makes against the background stars is called the ecliptic. We call it the ecliptic because the moon follows very close to this path, and when the sun, moon, and earth align, we experience eclipses. The planets and many asteroids also follow a path through the sky very close to the ecliptic.
If we extend this region of space outward in a plane away from the sun, we get what astronomers call the ecliptic plane. This represents the region of space once occupied by the accretion disk from which the planets formed. The original momentum of this disk is what we see today as the movement of the planets in their orbits. And that's why you never see planets or the moon far away from the ecliptic. Furthermore, the background stars that follow the ecliptic form the constellations of the zodiac. Therefore, the planets, the moon and sun always stay within the zodiac.
So next week, you'll get to see a great example of this. We have our sky set up for Tuesday, March 18th at 10 p.m. facing east. You'll see a waning gibbous moon forming a triangle with the red planet Mars up and to the left, and Virgo's blue-white star Spica up and to the right.
If you go outside after midnight that same night, you'll see the ringed planet Saturn rising in the east in the constellation of Libra the Scales. If you draw a straight line from Saturn over to the triangle formed by the moon, Mars, and Spica, you'll see the path of the ecliptic.
Let's fast forward one more night, and then, just after midnight, the morning of March 21st. Now, the moon is right next to Saturn. Did you notice how the moon moved along that imaginary line between Mars and Saturn? Making consistent observations like that, recording those observations, and then predicting future outcomes is essentially what scientists do.
Observe, record, predict,
and ultimately make sense of an ever-changing sky.
And it's all possible when you keep looking up.
The weather and wind changes out across the Bering Sea have been pushing the ice edge southward. However, ice strips have been flirting with St. Paul Island in the recent days. The ice edge now is still well away from St. Paul, and in the coming days it should start to shift the ice edge north and west a little bit more with the changing wind direction. So you're seeing ice strips north of St. Paul, the ice edge a little bit further north still, and there's plenty of room for improvement there. That looks like there may be some of that as we go through the weekend and into Monday. You can see the latest ice edge information anytime by going to weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. In southeast tomorrow, look for a south and easterly flow that's fairly steady between 20 and 30 knots or so. The strongest winds there just out of Yakutat with 17-foot seas. Higher gusts along the coast with a southerly flow in the north and south Lynn Canal. 20 knots there with a 4-foot sea. 5 to 7-foot seas on a 25-knot wind across the southern inner waterways there, with more of a southeasterly flow continuing on Saturday and picking up to 35 knots. Gales on the coastal areas as well. Slightly less wind the further north you go, diminishing there to the north and east at 25 knots with a 14-foot sea, and northerlies redevelop around the Lynn Canal, 25 knots with a 5-foot sea. Across south central, easterlies inside Prince William Sound as high as 25 knots, but higher gusts are possible with southeasterly winds coming into the outside areas of the Prince William Sound and the northern Gulf at 35 knots, and much stronger winds as you get down toward the Barren Islands. A westerly flow coming in on the south side of the storm that's working up the Cook Inlet, 40 to 45 knots all across the Barren Islands, Shelikof Strait, Kodiak Island, and the western Gulf, with 20 to 21-foot seas in the western Gulf, 10 to 12-foot seas in Shelikof Strait and west of the Barren Islands, and 5 to 9-foot seas in the northern and central parts of the Cook Inlet. Look for a southeasterly flow coming into the Kenai Peninsula at 40 knots. Conditions rapidly improve as we head into Saturday. A light and variable flow in the western Gulf on the eastern side of Kodiak Island and west of the Barren Islands. We're still looking at winds coming up Cook Inlet, though, between 15 and 20 knots from the south and west with 3 to 4-foot seas. A northwesterly flow will pick up speed as it heads out of Prince William Sound up to 20 knots with some higher gusts in the region. Freezing spray is still a threat there as well as over the Alaskan Peninsula. A west to northwesterly flow on the Bering side at 20 to 30 knots. On the Pacific side, 25 to 30 knots with 11 to 12-foot seas there. On Saturday, winds shift once again to the south and west with the exceptions of areas east of Chignik. Look for a westerly flow there, 20 knots with a 10-foot sea, and freezing spray will continue into the weekend. For the Aleutians, a west and northwesterly flow around 25 knots for the central and eastern chain, but we're looking at southerlies developing across the western tip of the chain, 25 knots around Attu and west of Kiska with an 8-foot sea, 10-foot seas though from the north and west over Kiska out toward Adak. Freezing spray will continue there, and on Saturday look for that threat to diminish somewhat. A southwesterly flow for the west and central parts of the chain, 18 to 19-foot seas expected as we head into Saturday, and a broad southerly flow strengthens anywhere from 30 to 40 knots with 35 knots around Unalaska on the Bering side with a 9-foot sea. Across the west, west and northwesterly flow cutting across the ice edge and into Nunivak Island and the Kuskokwim Bay area. Northwesterlies over the Pribilofs at 20 knots with an 8-foot sea, 20-knot winds from the north and west over Savunga and Gamble and St. Lawrence Island. By Saturday, there's our southerly flow starting to work the ice edge back away from the Pribilofs a little bit. 15 to 25-knot winds are expected in broad fashion with a 7-foot sea around the Pribilofs, 3-foot seas in Kuskokwim Bay with a 15-knot wind. And across the Arctic coast, easterlies out of the Beaufort Seacoast from 15 to 20 knots. A northeasterly flow coming down to about Point Lay, 20 to 30 knots there. Northwesterlies coming ashore from Cape Lisburne to Kotzebue Sound around 30 knots. So we get into Saturday, a big change. Southerlies start to work through the Bering Strait and up the Chukchi Seacoast, but we're still dealing with east and northeasterly winds, rounding the curve from Barrow toward Point Lay at around 20 knots. So rapidly changing conditions there for the Bering Strait. Recapping tonight's weather, a lot's going on in south central. Look for blizzard conditions around Kodiak Island and developing around the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula as we head through the daytime tomorrow. Blizzard warnings are in effect there. Winter storm and winter weather advisories posted for the west coast as snow will continue to fall. Many areas seeing as much as 6 to 8 inches of snow. About half of that's already fallen. Look for windier conditions around the Bering Strait on Friday with low pressure working into the interior. High wind warnings and advisories are still in effect for tonight and tomorrow for the Alaska Range and Deltana and Tanana Flats regions. Look for the wind to subside as high pressure develops across the interior, scattering some light snow across south central and the interior for Saturday, but still focusing snowfall across the west and northwestern parts of our state. And a new storm works into the Bering, this one dropping to 965 millibars in the western Bering, and another front works up southeast. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
If you are interested in serving on your local Federal Subsistence Regional Advisory Council, the deadline to apply is Friday, March 21st. The councils provide information and recommendations to the Federal Subsistence Board on subsistence hunting, trapping, and fishing. For more information on the advisory councils and how to apply, call 1-800-478-1456 or email subsistence@fws.gov. This message sponsored by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.